Hello, everyone, and welcome back to an episode of Change Itself. We've got a great show for you today, and we're going to have some in-depth conversations. Again, myself, Eric Demers, and we got Kati McCartney on board with FROSKR, and we're going to be unpacking a lot of the hot topics around environmental impacts from the mining sector and how things are being put in place to collaborate on the climate change initiatives. And Eric, welcome to the show, and welcome back. And what do you think about today's topic?
Right on, kind of timely. I mean, we've been experiencing, quite a bit of smoke here in the Sudbury area from, wildfires across, they'll call it the province, but I think it's the country right now. And yeah, I'm excited. It was in a conference last week, and that was one of the topics as well. So excited to get to hear more and learn more about this topic.
And I think we've brought on a great guest today to talk about that topic, since it's essentially her entire world these days. Welcome to the conversation, Kati.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So what's going on in your world, and how do you see things unfold as we all collaborate towards the greater good of the sustainability of our planet? There's a lot of things going on for FROSKR.
Just a big question to kick it off, eh? A little one. I don't know if many of your listeners or you guys know much about FROSKR and what we do, but that's probably a good place to start. We started a company right in the middle of the pandemic in 2020, and it's an environmental consulting company here in Northern Ontario. But we really started with mining clients, and it felt when we kicked it off a little bit silly to start an environmental consulting company in a pretty saturated market during a pandemic. So when we started to really unpack, why are we doing this? It wasn't really hard to answer that question, because many of us came from, a pretty barren Sudbury, came from mining, understood the impacts of mining, see a big smokestack in our backyard, feel, that we have kids in another generation, or as our Indigenous partners teach us, 7 generations to look out for now, that we have a planet to protect, and that we need mining actually to solve climate change. And so that started us to really understand our purpose as a company and give us that, why, that more other than a paycheck, why do we show up to work? What are we doing here? So FROSKR was really founded on supporting mining clients at first. And of course, now we handle, transportation and steel and a lot of other big and heavy industry. But our employees hustle hard for our clients because they understand the role that a lot of them are playing in solving climate change. So, we need mining, and we usually get a lot of heads turning, like, you're really an environmentalist and you love mining, and like, holy shit, a lot of people can't make that connection in their heads, honestly. So we try and advocate for mining to see it, because if, you guys, I don't know if you grew up in Northern Ontario, I didn't. So all I really knew is the, 2006 and on version of Northern Ontario. But before that, there's, really acidified lakes, really barren, like moonscapes, right?
We were on the Black Moon for many years. I remember growing up.
As training ground. So people knew that, and I didn't really believe them. So I think when you're part of that story and you understand that mining doesn't just have to be those tailings dam stories you see in the media, or the really negative media. And I usually, other folks have heard me say this, mining has made their bed. They do have some pretty poor performance. It's a really invasive practice. It changes, full natural landscapes, biodiversity, First Nations impacts for sure. So I'm not saying that they're totally innocent, but what we advocate for is a better way to do it, because we absolutely need mining. Like, you don't get to have solar panels, you don't get to have wind turbines, battery cars without mining. So we better get them to a better place. And that's where really FROSKR fits in. So long answer, but I hope that ties together a little bit what we're about, why we love this topic, and why we happen to love mining as environmentalists.
I mean, it's a long answer, but it's also a big journey. So it's very fitting. And, coming from the area, I also can attest that, I mean, Eric as well. Like I remember growing up, and we just grew up just on the outskirts of Sudbury here, and we would come to Sudbury for a weekend trip to the movie theaters or whatnot, because that's the only place where you can do it. And it was like, what, all these rocks, you're looking at black rocks everywhere, and the smokestack stuck out. And now when you see it today, and again, as a collaborative effort from the mining sector in the area, it's green everywhere. Like there's these magical trees that are popping up from and planting roots right into the rock, which is quite amazing actually. And I actually got to see a little bit of that as well when I went out west last week, where you've got all these massive trees that seem to be standing on nothing, because you can't necessarily embed roots in rock, but it's been done. So it's been cool to see how the regreening project has really transformed the city, and how it's been significantly impacting our air quality in the area. So that was one.
Can I ask you guys a question? Because one of the occurrences I had last week when I was in that conference, the presenter actually talked about what climate is, because I feel like before that, I don't think anybody's ever explained to me what climate actually means. Right? We talk about it all the time. Oh, climate change. Like, I have no idea what you mean. Like, I have my interpretation. The person across the room's got their interpretation, but nobody really talks about what actually is climate. Like, what do we mean by climate? So, Katie, I don't know, when you're talking climate or thinking about climate, what are you talking about, or what's your kind of definition?
That's a super good question, because really, I think it's kind of, there's topics out there that really greenwash or change, back to basics. What is it? I think there's a number of ways to interpret it. I think I would always go back to United Nations type sustainable development definitions that really, for me, it's about risk. Like, what does climate do to us as a society day to day? Well, that impacts getting good water. That impacts food. It impacts the way you live, the way we build. Right, we're starting to look at building and construction for those 50-year, 100-year storms. We didn't do that as well in the past. So climate to me is too big of a topic to really just give you one. I'm sure there's out there, we can Wikipedia it, but for me, it's about risk. Like, what does the climate mean on our day-to-day lives and society? And the irony in a lot of the conversations we have about climate is that mining happens to be one of the most susceptible industries to climate change. So the tricky piece, or the rush that we have ahead of us as environmentalists or innovators or change makers and mines happens to be, we got to get them there faster, because their ice roads are thawing because of climate change, because they don't have access to water. So we're starting to see zero water mining practices. Like, that's not a luxury anymore. That's a need today. COVID really expedited a lot of innovation in mining, but it really is about A, fighting climate change, and B, not even like A actually, and A, dealing with climate change. So if you have operations around the world, you're dealing with an inability to produce at a time where your demand is skyrocketing 40, 50%, and you don't know how to get there fighting climate change at the same time. So it's a huge topic. It's a really, for me, it's really hard to define. I don't know the exact way I would define it, but I would say that it's the risk of our livelihoods and production and society.
So what I heard is really like a chicken and egg piece around climate change, whether you're combating it or you're dealing with it and reacting to it. I think both are kind of heading in the same direction of trying to make an impact. The definition that was shared when we went to the conference, just to simplify it for the group of people that was there, was the average temperature for a given area for a 30-year period. And so when we start to talk about climate change, and that I had never heard it that way, but it at least gave me some point of reference. Like, because to your point, when I hear climate, I'm thinking about rain, and I'm thinking about drought, and I'm thinking about temperature, and I'm thinking about snow, thinking about frost. Like, all those different pieces do definitely come to mind. But it was interesting when the professor was speaking, put it that way, because the change, whether it's going up or down, is going to have an impact on the amount of rain you're going to get, the amount of frost or not, or which then affects biodiversity and then affects the water and whatnot's available for mining. So that was an interesting piece. Gus, I don't know what your take is or what how you've thought about it.
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously a lot of conversations about it, and there's also a lot of different initiatives on how to participate and collaborate on all doing our part, everywhere from consumership all the way to people producing what needs to get produced and everything in between. And one of the things that really caught my attention when we talked about it as well is to every action, there's a reaction, right? And sometimes the fine line of balance is so thin that we don't see what we're doing. So as an example, sometimes we're compensating because of things that we kind of crossed the line a little bit, and it's affecting us negatively. But then we retract so fast and so much that we also affect things negatively, right? So one of the things that really caught my attention, and then I'm not going to say the numbers because I'm going to get it wrong, and then I'm going to get booted off the internet probably for it. But one of the things that caught my attention was right now in our atmosphere. So if you look at the contribution, like what the population is contributing as far as particulates going in the atmosphere and how much CO we have in the air, the percentage that is there now is actually not that far away from where we want to be. But if we do drop below where we want to be, then we risk degreening our planet and causing other negative effects, because now the carbon is too low for us to sustain life on the planet. So that was a really interesting one for me, that when I caught that report, that it's important to know that we're not aiming for zero carbon. Like we're aiming for a carbon reduction to a certain degree where we know that we have a good balance. And I guess it goes along the same lines as if you remove all the wolves from a forest, then actually the forest dies. Like you need to have that balance in the ecosystem and the whole org chart of sustainability out there to make sure that everything thrives. And then you put wolves back in, and then all of a sudden the greenery comes back because now the pecking order is in balance again. So that was one of the things that caught my attention, because it is such a vast topic, right? So Katie, what has been some of the things that you've seen so far as like some of the most impactful solutions that could be coming to play? More specifically, because what seems to be ironic is that we're trying to mine less but produce more, which is kind of weird, right? To say, because now the permitting is becoming so difficult to open a mine, but we need as much material as we can because the consumership now is so high, especially that we have to transform everything from gas to from fuel to battery. So it almost seems like an oxymoron, right? So have you seen some significant advancements in other ways that's actually helped the mining sector start to transform how they produce? Or
yeah, I think it's really overwhelming, right? Just the way you're talking, I imagine people are listening going like, I don't know what to do. I equate it to sometimes the diet fad, right? Don't eat carbs, only eat carbs. Eat meat, don't eat meat. Like what do you do? What's the right call? And it can feel really overwhelming. Like the topic of just even the definition of climate, like what does my actions even make a difference? What's the point? So it is really overwhelming, and we should all just acknowledge it. I think there's a real lack of environmental literacy, is what we call it. Like just understand what this means. What is climate? What does it mean to you? What does your area look like? Why is mining a good solution? What can it do? No carbon, some carbon. So just a little bit more awareness and understanding and patience to say, I don't really know what I don't know. One thing we did really well in Northern Ontario, and FROSKR is a proud part of it, is to start that conversation on data rather than hypotheticals, right? Like seek the information from those that are part of it. So we have a technology that we use that's real-time monitoring for sulfur dioxide happens to be in the city of Sudbury, but we do it other areas, and it's for air quality. So for sulfur dioxide, and we feed that to 2 major smelters in the company. Every minute they get a piece of data, and it informs their operations. So if they see really negative numbers, they scale back, they don't impact or emit, and as a result, they don't produce. But what we're helping them do is also put that data online. So if you live just down the street or downwind from one of these smelters, you can now have access to the same data as the regulator, as the operators, and to start to inform yourself in a way that you might not have been able to before. You just saw, I say this in some talks often, like I imagine back in Sudbury Day where you smelled sulfur and you went, hell yeah, they're producing, this is prosperity. And to stop that smell and scale back meant everything comes at a cost, right? Like, what are we going to do? We're going to make money, or we're going to emit. There was always a binary conversation. And that's not the case anymore when we talk about this data and we talk about new innovation. We're actually able to show them all that sulfur come down on a graph over time since the 60s. And FROSKR is the example. Sophie is another great example. Technica is a great example. This area is booming with mining prosperity at a time where emissions are going down. And so it doesn't have to feel so overwhelming, but we need to start that chat about what role does mining have? Like, why is this demand for lithium, for nickel, for all these things going up? Well, we need them to help us get away from fossil fuels, like you said. But you can't do it in the same way that your grandparents used to. That's the cost. So the cost has to be done with innovation, with collaboration, with patience, from more meaningfully engaging our First Nations, like we didn't do in the past, and we're starting to understand and get better at stewarding that shared land, working with regulators to tell them, hey, these permits are outrageous, like we need to get there. And what's happening if you don't engage that regulator to help you get that permit faster? Well, people will go source that material in a pretty terrible socioeconomic place. So we need to get to a place where we're sourcing, manufacturing, using, recycling way closer to where we need to do that. So I don't know. I don't have the answer for how this thing feels less overwhelming, but I will say what we're proud to be having the conversation with is even with, I joked at the recent conference, a major mining conference, there was protesters talking about how terrible mining is with printed posters. And I want to run up to them and say, like, where did you print that? Like, we have to acknowledge that mining is everywhere. You need it. So get on board,
right? They got the megaphone and
your cell phone. Like, that doesn't come from tomatoes and bamboo. That comes from all kinds of things that we pull out of the ground. So we get on board in a more positive way about how do we pull this stuff out in a better way, manufacture it in a better way. That's what motivates the hell out of us right now, to say there are better ways. We're cross-pollinating from agriculture into mining. We're figuring out how to get faster, safer, less water, less carbon intensive. So really the things that motivate us, just do it in a less carbon intensive way than you used to, a safer way than you used to. That's super motivating for us. We have to be able to figure that out quicker.
Every worker deserves to go home safely at the end of the day. Book a demo with Sophie to discover how their groundbreaking EHS management software empowers workers to proactively avoid hazards, and how organizations like yours can cultivate a stronger work culture. Visit them at sophie.com to learn more. Technica Mining is a premier underground mining and construction contractor. They stand for delivering quality project work on time and on budget through innovative thinking. Their excellent safety record, experienced workforce, and large equipment fleet will guarantee the timely completion of all your project needs. Trusted by the world's leading mining companies, Technica Mining has over 20 years of experience in mine construction, development, and production. Contact Technica Mining to take your next mining project to the next level. Visit them at technicamining.com. Change Itself is produced by Crownsman, the voice of industry. Check out more, including The Crownsman Show, Mining Now, The Building Energy Show, and Agriculture Now at crownsman.com.
There's three things that I pulled out of what you just talked about that was super interesting. And one was, the transparency of measurement, because that is a question that people ask, right? They're like, okay, we're going to invest $5 trillion into this. Where do we know that we've made an impact? We can't look at the sky. We can't really look around us because it's going to be so incremental. We're never going to feel it. So so it's really cool that you mentioned about that transparency of data, which will allow for everybody to get to buy into what's going on, but also to be able to share across the world of what's possible. Because one of the things that you mentioned is that we can be kicking ourselves in a butt all day and trying to do the best we can over here, knowing that, one, we've got already one of the largest forests in the world that's actually, driving us to a certain level of sustainability, but also that our impact globally from a civilization standpoint is such a small percentage in compared to, Asia and South America and things like that. So, being able to share what we've learned and what we know of sustainable mining and how to pass that knowledge on to those other areas is going to be super useful, and that's where the big impact is going to be, right? So, and the third one is that the fact that a lot of technologies have not changed since the 50s. Like the mining process has not really changed from like a large, like the large processing pieces of a mine. They're the same. If you look at the engineering prints of today versus the engineering prints of the 50s, they're basically identical. Like there hasn't been a whole lot of innovation there. So I guess this is where the cool part is that it's going to draft that attention there so we can say, do we need that big of a smelter? Do we need that big of a hoisting plant? Do we need that? Do we still need to operate that way, or could we find a leaner, better way to do it? So
yeah, I know, Eric, it's something there's a quick anecdote. When I moved to Sudbury, I remember it was 2006 and I started with one of the major mining companies in the environment group. And I remember getting a call. It was a Brazilian owned company. And they said, we told them the regs are changing. You got to reduce your sulfur by this much. And they said, okay, well, what do we get for that investment? Like, how much more nickel do we get when we invest in this new technology? And we said, like, nothing. You just get to keep operating in Canada. Full stop. There's you don't get any more money. And they went like, what? Why would we ever do that? So that was a fun conversation. And recently those same mining partners now have to change their whole flow sheet because their customers aren't just steel anymore. They're Elon Musk now. Like there's a whole new way. They got to get this stuff in a different configuration. They haven't had to touch that flow sheet in I don't know, decades before I even knew what the mining industry was. But sorry, Eric.
No, it's all good. And I think it's interesting that you're touching on that. I think naturally the way some of this work will definitely get out, as I would imagine or predict, is that some of the there's going to be a financial gain. Like, yeah, we're going to have to figure out a way to do it cheaper, faster, better. Like there's just no other way of doing it. And so, which will result in better for the environment. Like that's just naturally what's going to happen.
And I think they'll be able to charge a premium. Like you'll start to see, nickel producers say we have a lower carbon product. And so it's a premium product now versus, so you can charge a premium for something like that, where before you might have just had, if it was cheaper, it was cheaper. But now you get to say you can disclose that it's a little bit better for the planet. That's better for marketing, better for everybody overall, helps you meet whatever guidelines ISO you're trying to, market yourselves as.
Yep. The other piece that I was going to touch on before, I find there's an interesting parallel. I'm in the realm of health and safety. So I find it like when I look at the culture of safety over the years, like you think back to like the Neil George card and like the fatality injury charts over time, like, yeah, they're coming down. And so I sort of kind of feel the similar piece with the environmental side of things, where it's just, there's been no real awareness. So we're kind of in like that awareness, like opening our eyes. We kind of don't know necessarily what's going on. And that's maybe naive because a lot of people already do know, but there's a big segment of the population that might not. We're just becoming aware of this and the impacts. And it's why it feels so overwhelming. And the more we talk about it, the more we're aware of it, we can actually start to see how we can make an impact. So I don't know if there's any, like, if you're seeing any cultural shifts in people reaching out and asking for information or asking for different things, but that'd be something I'd be interested in knowing about.
I think the mining sector itself has always had a bit of a communication problem. I don't think they really advocate well all the good advances they're doing on all fronts: safety, innovation, environment. But I think it was hard to talk about and package environment the same way health and safety. Like you're talking about lives, we're talking about maybe fish or aquatic, different life. So it was a little hard to understand it or put tangible impacts to it. And what the mining industry is doing really well, particularly in Canada, they have maybe new standards that not everybody is aware of, but they're starting to disclose it and calibrate it so that you can watch performance more transparently on a lot of sectors. So on water, on wildlife, on First Nations impacts, on everything from climate, so carbon disclosure, tailings dam risks, areas where we probably did an okay job managing risk, but it wasn't really standardized or calibrated like maybe safety was, right? When we talked about like lost time injuries, or those words became pretty standard before a lot of environment was kind of a checkbox on a project. What I also think happened is a whole generation of people started to demand it, right? They want to work for a better company, and those values don't just include societal, right? The whole ESG, so environmental, social, and governance now, of how a company is perceived or led. There's a whole generation of workers demanding that. They don't just show up anymore. They work in a different way than, myself or our parents used to work. So I think it's forcing the shift for us to get that next generation of labor shortage that we have coming up and attract them to being part of something bigger, answering that question, but also understanding more that environment is like a lot of disciplines, right? You can be a carbon or an air specialist or a water specialist or closure planning or permitting or, the bugs and bunnies stuff that not everyone talks about. So there's a huge, huge range of careers and pieces. And so it's kind of tough to understand or talk about as an industry. But I will say we really are at the forefront. Canada has some of the best practices, which is why a lot of our permitting takes time. We are leading the way in a lot of innovation, low carbon practices. So we have a lot to be proud about. And I think these kind of new towards sustainable mining or standard and practices that the Mining Association of Canada and Ontario Mining Association are starting to put together are going to help with that, to Gus's point earlier, transparency, data sharing, education, environmental literacy.
So
it's
Katie,
interesting because it looks like the license to operate is now twofold, right? Because you got a license to operate based on legislation, but then you got license to operate based on who's going to want to work for you, right? Like
or your investor, right? Like you can walk around that PDAC conference, like everybody's mouth says ESG, everybody. And so you better get your game together or be able to show how you show up versus stacked against the same people producing in the same city even.
Yeah.
So the interesting part with that too is Gus and yourself have touched on it earlier, was the piece around consumership. Like consumers keep growing. You talked about recycling. You talked about the reality is we can't keep up with just recycling. We're going to continue to need more and more. So I think there's a definitely an interesting challenge there on like, we need to grow, yet we need to do it in a very sustainable fashion that doesn't increase or as I see it, maybe doesn't increase some of the emissions and the pollutions involved while producing more metals. So what are some maybe things, and I know we've been kind of touching on it throughout, but are there specific things that are being done out there, or like how do we get there?
Yeah, I think there's a few ways, right? Well, you can't change anything unless you measure it, right? You got to know what you're doing. So a lot of this started before we didn't really measure everything that well. So even, emissions from underground or particulate coming off road dust, right, from tires just spinning around, or the emissions that come from something simple like picking up a waste rock pile and dropping it somewhere else. There's stuff that comes out of there. What is it? How harmful? How much? So we did a good job over the last couple of decades of measuring, and then understanding what roadmap you would need to change that. And some of the bigger things that you can see right now all over, the Ernst & Young's or the PDAC conferences, a lot of them are BEVs, like battery electric underground. How do we get all this stuff to surface with less emissions, better safety? But that's still really, not adopting as quickly. I think there's other technologies that we don't talk about as well, which are in the processing part. How are we pulling out stuff before it even gets out? We don't have to clean it up after. And then technology I talked about earlier, which we're really proud of, is that real-time monitoring type of technology, where before, these poor producers were sitting there going, emit, on, or don't, off, based on wind, based on whatever. And now with a bit of technology, they can prevent a really negative event because they can see the emissions creeping up over time and make the call to scale back, but they don't have to turn off. So they can keep producing, keep meeting demand at maybe 50%, where before it was 0 or 1. And so I think technologies like that are, more AI, more intuitive, understanding prevention versus reaction, having those kinds of conversations, really technology adoption skyrocketed during COVID. Just look at the way we're having this call now, right? We didn't do that before. So, enacting drones, thinking about how do we get less water into operations, or do we recycle it differently? There's a whole tertiary and secondary economy that happens in mining for recycling that we don't all see usually, right? Like taking a bag house that was scrubbing all of these particulates in a process and selling it to another company to reprocess because they want to use that. So before, maybe that went and got shipped off to a landfill or tailings. Now we're considering, okay, let's get smarter about how do we use those things. So I think there's a billion examples out there. What it really boils down to is just doing it better per unit of whatever you're producing, a better way. So less carbon per that one unit before. And whether that's trucking or water or processing or people power, however you're doing it, it's just measuring that is where we really start the conversation and disclosing it, getting better at talking about how we measure it, how we disclose it. And then what are we trying to do? Before there was all that net zero, or I gotta be net zero by 2030 or 2050 or whatever. And those felt, maybe even pre-pandemic, like crazy aspirational goals. We were like, yeah, nice. That's a marketing ploy, like a good chance. Those are happening like next year. It's crazy how fast this can happen when there's enough willingness for it to happen. But I do think mining has a communication problem. Like they got to get out there and talk about how much better things have been since the images we have in our mind or our future past generations' minds about what mining really looks like.
And I think the environmental impacts are probably going to be the same kind of pattern as how we saw fatalities in the past in the mining sector, right? It used to be like part of the conversation, not necessarily from like, we don't want it to happen, but we know it's going to happen. We know we're going to lose somebody at X amount of meters underground. We know, and then they just factored it in where now it's no longer acceptable to even think that way. I think it's going to end up doing the same thing on the environmental side, where it was like, yeah, every once in a while we have to discharge X amount of waste and it just is what it is, to now it's going to be, it's going to shape into, it's no longer acceptable to do that. So what are we going to do about it? And the one part that I'm really interested about, Katie, and I don't know if you heard any buzz around that, but what comes to my mind all the time when you start thinking about the consumership and how much the mines have to produce, and it seems like it's a massive task that the mines have to produce all of the materials that need to be produced to transform, how we live. But then there's the whole, like, I've always wondered, I've been in technology forever. So, we haven't, our iPhone on our desk or whatnot, but do we need to have one every year? Do we need to replace it every second year? Like, if it's still working, why are we changing it? So I think what I would like to see in the long term is also have some kind of governance on the retailers or people that are actually manufacturing things, to say, make them better so that you can buy one, it lasts longer, so that we're not constantly filling up our landfill or having to spend the money or even, because recycling does have a toll on the environment as well. Like it's there for environmental reasons, but it's also tough to recycle a lot of the things that we want to recycle. So I've always been curious to see, when is the day that somebody sits that stamps it that says you're only allowed to use X amount of material per year and keep up with demand, and let's move on that way. Like, have you had any conversations around that? Or
yeah, there's two really good examples recently. We're working with a steel producer, actually, which is a new client to Little FROSKR starting up, but not little anymore, I guess, more mature startup FROSKR, I should say. They approached us to start talking about life cycle analysis of a product, which we hadn't really seen in some industries, like to a point. What's the life cycle of a phone? We talked about that for like concrete or for certain buildings. What's the life cycle? Meaning everything has a carbon footprint, from pulling it out of the ground to, let's talk about the phone. We got to pull all this stuff out of the ground to get it. We got to manufacture it. We're going to use it, then recycle it. So from cradle, which we call like the mine or extraction, to grave, like recycling or end of life, that all has a footprint. And so a lot of products, to your point about governance, how are we going to talk about that? A lot of products have that life cycle analysis, or starting to be mandated to talk about that. And what I think we didn't do a really good job of, which we're starting to, is fully understand that disclosure. What we talk about a lot in environment are different emissions. So you might hear like scope 1 emissions, scope 2 emissions, scope 3 emissions. And to get a little geeky for a minute on that, that is really a hard thing to quantify for an industry. So even let's just talk about like Canada Post, right? There's scope 1 emissions, or all the emissions they have to get mail to people. That's like driving a truck, flying a plane, whatever. The scope 2 is all the buildings they have to heat, all the heat that comes in, all of the stuff to make their operations work from heat and power sources. And then scope 3 is everything else. Like how much emissions come to make an envelope? All of the, trucking in of lunches or food, that's all scope 3. It's extra, someone else's emission, but you need it for your operations. And when you draw that parallel to like an iPhone or a mining operation, scope 3 is really hard to get good handle on or draw fence posts around to say that's all in, that counts. So when we work with some of our clients to disclose carbon, let's talk about like a major trucking company. Their scope 1 is all their trucking. All of the gas they use to truck everything for a company, scope 2, all of the heat they need, power for their building. Scope 3 is what, right? Like, let's talk about all the manufacturing for the tires they have to put on their vehicles, for all of what is all of this extra and scope 3. What's cool is they are, this trucking company is the scope 3 to a mining operation. So if they get better at getting more, less carbon intensive, then they can go tell a mining partner, hey, I'm going to reduce your scope 3. And then they can reduce the scope 3 when they produce for an iPhone. So this whole chain of a life cycle analysis now doesn't seem quite so complicated. Or maybe it's more complicated. I'm not doing a good job explaining it, but it's a nice
PPE you have to put on. Like that's a whole other thing.
So it's a neat, it's a topic not everybody fully understands, but to show the interconnectivity or the life cycle of some product, now you can really start to understand, like, yeah, it does make a big difference when you recycle properly at your house, because there's a ripple effect or a chain effect to everything that happens there. So.
Well, when we were I was at that conference last week, and the cell phone example came out, and the professor talked about, he was presenting to a high school class, and one of the students, I can't remember what the comment the student made, but to give them a sense of like how much carbon was actually used in the production and the life cycle of that phone, I can't remember if it was 100 or 200 kilograms. So it's like basically you got to walk around with like a 200 kg brick in your pocket. And like that really made the students look at it a little different. Definitely an interesting topic. And I know that we could go on forever, but I also know we're getting a little bit long in our hour in our conversation. So any final thoughts, Katie?
No, thank you for, I don't know how much a lot of your viewership talks about this topic, but it's always an opportunity and honor for us to be able to talk about our partners in the mining industry, our First Nations partners. We love being part of a local, an economy up, and especially in Northern Ontario, hopefully advocating and opening up some eyes to folks who didn't embrace mining and maybe would start. So thanks for the chance to chat with you guys.
It was a pleasure. And if you had a call to action for people listening, as far as like how they can get involved or how they can learn more or be part of the conversation, you have something for them? Where do they go?
Yeah, I would just say it's not really a luxury anymore to turn a blind eye. Like we have, our grandchildren we haven't even met yet deserve better from us. So I think that's the pressure that I certainly feel. And, I mentioned it earlier, but our First Nations partners really teaching us about making decisions with 7 generations in mind. So, that one bottle you didn't recycle, not really a huge deal, but if you're doing that every day or every week, or you're not calling your family out or your friends out on doing it, we all play a small part. We don't necessarily connect it or see it. So it's not time to ignore that anymore, or not call people out on getting just a bit better. Be an eco-friend.
Just before we leave, Katie, thank you. And thank you for the impact you're having and the work you're doing at FROSKR to help make this world a better place. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Yeah, we have a big team. I can't say it's, we have a wicked team that runs around doing a lot of this really important work. So I would be, it's not me, it's them.
Well, thanks a lot, Katie. And thanks a lot, everybody, for following and for watching along. I hope you learned a lot about the conversation today. And once again, if you haven't done so, go ahead and hit the like button and give us a comment as to what you thought. And if you're watching us on YouTube, you would go ahead and ring that bell and tell us what you think. And we look forward to connecting with you next time. And thank you for following.